Thank you everyone for joining us for this office hours session today, where we will be focusing on unraveling the gnarly question around how to diagnose your SLA. And it's really great to see some familiar faces here as always and meet some new ones. So a couple of logistical things. You can feel free to press the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you have any questions for us. And we will be taking a few moments throughout the presentation for Q&A. And since we always have a good amount of questions, we will filter to some of the top ones y'all are asking. And it would be great for you to use the Q&A button rather than the chat, so we can ensure that we get to your questions in a timely manner. Also, the webinar will be recorded, and we will be sending out follow-up materials as well to anyone who RSVP'd. These follow-up materials will include time with Adrian as well as Shelton if you would like to chat more specifically about WFM best practices, as well as how to implement these concepts in your assembled instance directly. My name is Valerie, and I am on the product marketing team here at Assembled. Some of you all may know me from my days in customer success, and I'll pass along to my co-host Adrian to give an intro of himself as well.
Thanks, Valerie. So my name's Adrian. I'm on the solutions team. I was actually previously on the marketing team with Valerie. I have been here with Assembled now since last fall, and I've been doing workforce for about 13 or so years. Hopefully now I see there's like over 40 people in here that you are starting to hear these intros once a month and starting to come back on a recurring time frame. So hopefully we're seeing some of you again today.
Amazing. So in today's office hour session, we'll be covering a number of topics and starting off with the importance of SLA and setting realistic goals for your team across the various channels, as well as the different types of businesses you all work at. Secondly, we will be looking at the various ingredients that go into an SLA diagnosis, looking at staffing, volume, handle times, and much more, and give you all a framework around how to approach this. We'll also be addressing that looming question about how to explain your findings to your leadership team. And then lastly, we'll be giving a brief overview of how to diagnose this in Assembled itself. And this will be quite a high level overview because every one of our customers has a unique setup and needs. So we will be sending out a link for you all to schedule some time with our success team to go over these concepts in your instance directly. Pass it on to Adrian to start us off.
Great, thanks, Val. So let's jump into the importance of SLA here. And SLA, I know we sometimes use a lot of acronyms in our workforce roles, WFM, SLA, AHT, and it just goes on and on and on. But the SLA, or your service level agreement, as a lot of us may already know, is basically the service commitment between you and your customers. In your contact centers, or whatever sort of center you're calling it, it's usually defined on the measure of speed at which the customer gets a first response. And that's a very important distinction, that you can have SLAs set on different metrics, but at least the ones that we are discussing and the one that is the most often is the first response. So that's when the customer calls in. That first response is right as it gets past the IVR, the person picks up, says, hello, thank you for calling, yada, yada. On chats, that could be when a chat is connected, but then also you need to understand it's when the first message usually gets sent, not just the connection. And then emails is that really delayed one where somebody can send in an email, and a pretty popular time for email response is having a 24-hour first response SLA. So that can be, maybe 23 hours and 59 minutes is still meeting that to get the first message out there. Setting that target here, definitely a crucial step in determining, your needed staffing or your requirements. It's less important on some of those email channels where you have maybe a 24-hour time to respond. But on your synchronous channels, you definitely need to make sure that you have a goal set. That's what you feed into your Erlang calculations, your staffing software Assembled to actually get a full requirement built out. One thing that's interesting to note here is you might go onto websites like AWS, even our own website, and see things that are like service guarantees. And it is not the same as an SLA service or those uptime guarantees. You'll usually see it something like 99.99%. Hopefully it's that high if you've got a really quality company that you're working with. But for SLAs, obviously it wants to be a lot lower. We'll dig into that in a little bit, but they're normally maybe 80, 85%, and something that's not exactly published to customers. It's used internally, but a customer maybe is not going to understand, oh, it's only 80%. That seems kind of low when AWS has like 99.9% uptime. Just an important distinction there. So let's jump in. We've gone over what the SLA or the service level is, and let's jump into setting the realistic goals for your team. This is an important one because it can be very exciting to say, oh, we're going to answer 100% of our contacts in 10 seconds. Leadership is really going to love something like that, but from the workforce side, you need to have something that's actual reasonable that you can manage to. So break it down into a couple steps here. And step one is definitely determine what matters most to your customers. Just a couple examples here is, the customer is okay with longer wait times, or do they need the fast service? If you just look at that question, you're like, of course they want fast service. So let's break it down into maybe different types of contexts here. Your healthcare, maybe more of the personal touch. So like, sometimes of a longer wait time, or even just like the longer overall contact time. Your financial stuff, you want that quick, fast service. I actually got some messages, as we all do, when we get spam messages every day, and I had to call my bank, and I wanted to be answered very quickly and not wait 10 minutes to see if that random thing had been bought and was actually a real charge. And then sometimes you've got something like the emergency services or the 911. It needs to have maybe that fast service, but also the personal touch there as well. So these are some of the things you need to start to determine when you're setting your SLAs and other goals. The next step here is look at your channels and the queues and how you have that set up. So we talked about with email and chat and phone, some of the big three channels that we have here. And we talked about how phone is synchronous, chat is synchronous, but you might have multiple chats. There can be some delay there. And then email is going to have some delay between the messages, and that's understandable when you actually send an email, and some customers will choose that. So you want to have your SLA goals set separately there. Obviously, for email, you don't want to have something like 80% of your emails are get a response in 40 seconds or less. That makes no sense. Might as well have a live channel then. But for your live channels, you obviously can't go and say, we're going to get our first response in 2 hours, because that only works for the asynchronous or email or even social, some of those types of channels. And then if you break it up a little bit more, you've got your channels, but then inside of your queues. So don't just set and say, okay, for all of our phones, it's going to be 80% of our calls answered within 40 seconds or less. You may have ones that need to have a longer SLA and ones that have a shorter SLA. If you've got that priority support, you probably want to have that even shorter. Hopefully your volume is a lot less, because the shorter your SLA goes, the more expensive it's going to be. And then you have your standard calls, or maybe like your general ones, and you can have a longer SLA there. You probably have a lot more of that volume. Just make sure you're looking at it and adjusting per each channel, per each queue there. And then set your goals and test them. I've thrown around the 80% in 40 seconds. That's what we used at T-Mobile for a lot of the channels. So it's just stuck in my head. It'll probably never get out. But when you set these, don't set it and forget it. I have probably said this in every single webinar that we have done so far, but when you set something, it is okay to change your mind, to go back in and say, hey, this isn't working, whether it's we are answering too quickly or we're answering not quickly enough and we're seeing some impacts there. Checking your customer satisfaction, that is a good way to see if the SLAs that you have set are working correctly. To give an example there, at Stripe, we actually had our standard chat set to about 30 seconds for the first response time. There was some concurrency as well. And then we were having a tough time, as you can see here, trying to get that last little part optimized down to get to that 30 seconds. Those aggressive goals, they sound nice, but you're going to spend a lot more time, getting those resources to push your SLAs above that like 80, 90%. So we saw this, and we started looking at the customer satisfaction scores for customers that were waiting even just 5, 10, 15 seconds longer, we were getting hit with our SLAs, but to the customer, they were still getting answered relatively quickly. It was a chat, so they weren't on a phone with it up to their head, not able to, browse what they wanted to. They could do their chat and go back to their work and wait for the ping. And we realized that we didn't see a drop off until about 50 to 55 seconds. And then we would see a pretty noticeable drop off of customer satisfaction scores. So what did we do? We adjusted our SLA up. We immediately went from being understaffed to being staffed correctly, didn't have to spend any extra money, didn't impact the customer at all, didn't impact the agents by having to move them around, and basically just moved the goal to be more applicable to what we were actually already servicing as a company and customers were okay with. So just a little visual here to back that up. This is that 80-20, that Pareto principle. You're going to get the maximum amount of your result from that first 20 or so percent you put in. And then you're going to spend a lot of time, a lot of money, which is real important in the workforce time, a lot of headcount, which directly ties back to the money. You're going to burn people out trying to optimize to that last, that high, super high SLA percentage. Something that we haven't talked about in this webinar, but we have in other ones, is you'll see your occupancies go down because people are sitting around just trying to be available to get to that next contact that comes in. So really just think about that 80-20 principle, go for what works, check and adjust from there. There's no one answer to fit them all. Even inside your company, you'll probably see, if you have a large enough one, that different SLAs for maybe different queues that you thought were similar, you can have different SLAs and they both work equally as well. So we've gone through what SLA is, how to set sort of goals here. I'm going to pause for just a second before we go into diagnosing it and see if there are any questions from the crowd here. I'm not seeing a thumbs up from Val or Shelton. Okay, great. Well, let's jump right into diagnosing it here. Everybody knows what SLA is. Everybody's got them set. Awesome. So now the main thing that we get asked in workforce, why did I miss my SLA? I was not a fan of getting this question. Usually when I got this question, it means that I already didn't have an answer. So it was a really tough one. But for anybody even starting out or just kind of looking at, oh my gosh, I had a week, the last week that things happened. Where do I even start here? So, they can look daunting at first, but at the core here are the SLA is just an output of a fancy supply and demand problem. Take it one step at a time. This is applicable to most things in life, but break it down into the smaller parts and just go through those one by one to help build your story. One of the things here to really understand, though, is that there's usually not a smoking gun. Examples of this is you don't always see maybe a huge volume spike where volumes were 200-300% above what you expected. And it's like, oh, I can say that's SLA. But maybe you do see that, but you also want to make sure that you are kind of diving in and getting the whole story here. So don't look for the smoking gun, build your story based off of the individual parts. So we've got this graph over here, and I'm going to break this down into the supply and demand here, and we'll go through that. So you see here, we kind of split it up with your supply being on the top, supply staffing. Now we can go into much more detail than this, but your supply is comprised of the staffing, the agents, the people who are actually there to serve your customers. And so the question here is did I staff to my required staffing? If we want to get really into the weeds, there's the required staffing that we thought we were going to need with our volume and our handle time forecasts. And then there's the required staffing that we actually needed. So this is a good way to start, but make sure that you are not saying everything in this webinar, like this is what Adrian said, this is the only thing I'm going to look at. This is where you start and then start to build out the processes that work better for you. So start off with your staffing. You look at that and say, okay, well, that's great, but staffing, how do I even start to dig into that? And you say, all right, what are three big parts? Not all of the big parts. What are three big parts of the staffing? Adherence. Did my agents work the schedule they were supposed to? That's a big one. You can have people coming in and logging out and not when you expect. We see this a lot of times when there are call centers that don't really go after the adherence, and you might have everybody that takes lunch together because they want to. We're all people, we want to do that, but if you have a large portion of your people log off at the same time, you're going to get hit, even if you had everybody there on paper. Conformance. Did we get the hours to match the times that were needed? This is not the most looked at metric because it is a little bit harder to dig into. Conformance is you can have If somebody was supposed to work 6 hours out of the day, but their 6 hours completely don't match their schedule, not only is that an adherence hit, they may have conformed to the amount of hours they were supposed to give, but they didn't give them at all when they were supposed to. So it's kind of a counterpart to your adherence here. And then shrinkage, all of these tie together. Shrinkage is how much away from the queue time did we have? You could have great adherence, but if your shrinkage was 50, 60, 75% because everybody had a nice barbecue going on, or the ice cream truck came by and everybody got off the phones to go do that, well, it's great. Everybody was there working what they were supposed to, but we didn't have enough people scheduled. So that's how we break it down into the staffing side here. I do see that there is a question that just came in, and since I can see that, let me try to look at this. Okay, would occupancy be considered a factor in the staffing, especially if the ACD tool doesn't force a distribution, but the agent actually needs to accept the interaction? I think I understand what the question is here. So let me try to answer it here. The occupancy is an output of what's happening with, really you can kind of boil it down to the SLA, because that's a measure of effectively how busy people were. So if you are busy, you've got a lot of calls coming in, your occupancy is going to climb up, right? Because these people are going back to back. They're going to be super occupied for their time. If you are in a slow time, then your occupancy is going to be a lot lower because you just don't have the volume there to keep them engaged. I think for the second part, if the agent actually needs to accept the interaction, that is a good point there. This is going back to my Stripe example. This is something that we saw as well on our chat. Chats would be delivered to agents. So they would see a ring, a notification, and the customer, let's say they would sit in queue for 30 seconds. The chat would get delivered to the agent by 29 seconds or right before our SLA cutoff, but the agent wasn't answering the chat and sending that hello, whatever the first opening message is, for another sometimes 30 seconds or a minute. This is something that you would miss your first response SLA because the first response is outside of that total time frame, but you need to be able to dig in deeper and say, hey, from the workforce side, we are delivering the chat to the agent within the specified SLA target of, well, let's call it 45 seconds. We're getting it to them within 45 seconds. They are getting the ping, they are getting the notification. The agents are then taking longer to respond. At Stripe, we dug into this, did a whole report, and we actually passed this off to our team leads and said, hey, this is now an agent behavior problem. The machine, the routing is doing everything that it can to get it to them, but if they don't click the response, we're going to continue to miss SLA. And it actually helped us determine that for some agents, they weren't getting an audible or a visual like ping when the new chat came in. We actually found out that we had an option to auto assign the chats and not let somebody be able to click to accept. And then we found out that there were some low performers who, even if they only had one or so chats and weren't concurrent, just didn't like to accept the chat. So we went through those. There was many options. There wasn't one right option. And we tested out to finally find out, hey, what can we do to help fix the customer experience, fix the SLA here? But it was an interesting one because Workforce had met all the obligations, but we didn't stop there. We wanted to help out and make sure that we continued to solve the root cause there. So there we go. We've got the staffing side, so your supply side here. And let's click over to our demand side. Now I've broken it down to pretty simple here. Demand, we've got your workload, we've got what is being asked of our agents to do right now. So once again, did I staff to my required staffing, or really even was the workload kind of what I expected? For volume, oh, it looks like we might have had the notes that got copied down here incorrectly. So I'll go with it. On the volume here, were we above or below? That's a real simple one here. Did we get more volume than we expected? Did we get less volume than expected? Handle time, very similar. Were our agents meeting the handle times that we had outlined in our calculations? Were they going above? Were they going below? You can definitely see a mix and match on this. Sometimes at T-Mobile, we would see when there was a large outage that volumes would heavily spike up. But once that outage got figured out, then the handle times could drop when the agents had some sort of, we know it's an issue, we're sorry, here's maybe something that we can offer you, and we can't really fix it for you, so the ETA is 2 hours, get off the phone, get to the next person. So these don't always go hand in hand. Sometimes they can be inverse of each other. That's why it's important to figure out each part and not look for that smoking gun, actually find out each little part that makes up your SLA misses here. And so one last tip here before I open up to some more questions is look down to the interval level. Don't just look at your weeks, don't just look at your days. For any of those supply demand metrics, the overall month, week, day can be within bounds and SLA is still missed. So you might look at the day and be like, oh my gosh, our volume kind of like came in fine for a Tuesday. Our handle time, things look fine. But when you break it down to the individual metrics, you might actually see like, oh, wow, we had so many intervals where we are at 0% SLA with the high volume that the rest of the day can't even outweigh it. Like maybe volume dropped below plan for the rest of the day. So it kind of evens out, but you had so many 0% that when you do the math and you average it all together, you just can't fix the entire day. You can't fix the entire week. This is where you need to not just look at that day, start digging down to each interval, whether that be hour, 30 minutes, or if you really enjoy looking at data, 15 minutes, and you get down to there. And then just understand that those bad hours, those bad days can ruin the entire time frame you're looking at. So it's important to identify those and call them out when you're explaining this. So I think that there is one other question that came in. So on these, the question is, how would you attribute these individual parts into impact on service level in a mathematical measurable way? Great question. The best way to do that is to take each part that we were just talking about, whether that's supply or demand, and then we'll start with the demand first. Actually calculate your demand through your Erlang, through everything with your actuals that came in. So you can say, okay, our volume was up 50%, but our handle time was down 7.5%. You can probably get away with the quick hand wavy and just do the difference in there and say overall it was up by X amount, but that's not going to be the same. You might have different intervals and different weighting here. So if you have the ability to actually go back and run the workload with what actually came in, put it through your Erlang calculations, and you can say, okay, here's the actual workload. Do it one at a time. Here was the volume differences with the handle time we expected, and then here was the handle time with the volume expected, and then here's the total difference. And you can mathematically point out and see like, here was just the part from volume. Then handle time actually lowered the overall impact, and then here was the total. The math there was probably 42.5% increase in workload. Same thing with your staffing. You can go back in and just say, hey, we had X% shrinkage, so that just took out X amount of hours. That's the kind of math you can do pretty quickly. Or same thing with adherence. We had X amount of adherence and moved X amount of hours out of where we were expecting it. And then you also have the workload to back it up. So that's how I build it. You go into maybe your waterfall chart or something and just kind of layer that on as to each part. And you will see some build it up, some bring it down, and then overall you see the SLA miss. So I am not seeing any other questions, but these are really good questions that have come in.
Actually, one other question came in that I think would fit in this section before we move on to the stakeholders, if that's cool. So can you overcompensate for missed SLAs due to larger volumes by getting more aggressive in other intervals in order to hit a day or week's SLA if it gets bombed by a few high volume times?
I love that question. Whoever asked that, thank you. No is the short answer here. And it sucks to hear that. And the reason it's no is because let's say your SLA, and I'm not going to be able to do the math justice with my hands and everything right here. Let's say your SLA goal is 85%. And you had a lot of interactions come in that were very low, 20% SLA, or whatever your time frame is, 5%, 0%. When you're looking at the weighting, there's a lot more room to go down from 85% to 0 than there is from like 85 to 100. So when you have this massive amount of volume that's going to give you a whole bunch of zeros that you're averaging in, and then even if you perfectly staff for the rest of the time and your volume's to plan, if you don't have enough volume to weigh out those zeros, it's just not going to be there. So no matter how well you staff, if you don't have the volume, even if they're all 100%, it's not going to be there. And honestly, even if if the volume was exactly the same as all your zeros, it still wouldn't be there, because when you have a whole bunch of hundreds and a whole bunch of zeros, you're going to average out to 50%, when really your target's up here to like 85. So you actually have to have even more volume than those zeros to start averaging it out and bringing it up. Like I said, I'm probably not doing justice. If somebody who actually knows how to do the math can probably prove this, or hopefully not prove me wrong really well. But that's where you just, you can throw bodies at it, but if you just don't have the volume to come back in, you're just going to be wasting money and, keeping occupancies low and keeping people around. We'll actually go into that right here as to what's a good maybe mitigation step or a way to explain it after that. Any other questions before we move on though? Great. All right, so explain it to your stakeholders. That was a great question that goes into this. So gather your data, build a story here, be clear about what drove the SLA misses. Don't guess. Obviously, you can take educated guesses, but please do as much research as you can. Find out what it is. It really sucks when you go to explain some of these things and you've missed something where we're talking about the volume and say, oh, it was definitely volume. And somebody says, yeah, but what about adherence being at like 50%? You want to have that also as a story. Even if you know it didn't drive it all the way, have that as part of your story here. Be ready to explain if it's a pattern, why or why not. It's pretty self-explanatory here. An outage, things that are not patterns, adherence misses, you can start to dig into those, see if that's kind of an overall thing. Maybe if it's specific times of day, you can go down to different agents if you have that level of granularity and see if that is a pattern there. If you're large outliers, like we were just talking about, took out your entire days or weeks, call them out and say, hey, our Chicago market went down on Tuesday and that really impacted. And then the second part to what the question that just came in is run the data without those outlier times. So go back and take your SLA and then just drop out. If it was only a few hours on a day, drop out that like 0%. It's a really good way to show, hey, workforce, look, the week or the day might have sucked, but you can see all the times that it wasn't outside of our control with an impact that came in. We were meeting, we were doing just fine. We maybe even did a good job of keeping this from kind of like having the hangover impacts where they impact after the outage is over. So here we would be at our goals, except for the outage, and you can kind of break that out and say, people have done adjustments to earnings. We do this all the time. You kind of adjust that to show your story. You don't want to just kind of hand wave it away, but show that there was actual good work and that workforce knows what they're doing and not just falling down on the job here. Number two, explain mitigations and impact here. If you had some mitigations, like bringing in some of that extra staffing, if you had overtime you could go after, did you do cross-skilling? This is a great one to explain what was done and then see if there's any sort of impacts. Did you bring in people from your technical support to help out on your general care, and then technical support got also queued up? That would be an example of a downstream impact to explain and say, oh, technical support wasn't part of the outage, but they got impacted by helping out over here, kind of spreading the load across the company there. And then the last one here is, be creative and have a plan or some sort of narrative on what's going to be prevented going forward. Shift that narrative from workforce messed up the plan to workforce has some awesome ideas to prevent it from happening again. If you don't have a cross-skilling, maybe you start to look at, okay, now can we find some people that we can cross-skill if we need to? Maybe there can be a certain thresholds. We have talked with management and we are allowed to open overtime if these thresholds get met. So you don't have to go through the red tape if somebody's sleeping, and that can just be something that's approved and you can fall back to that. These are sort of things that you can say, hey, not only was there something that happened, here's what we did to it. And then finally, here's what we're going to do to help make these not as impactful going forward. And then as our buddy Cal here says, don't just look at the bad times. We are always strapped for time, but if we only look at the bad times, we are not going to see when we actually did meet service levels and learn from what we're doing there. So we're going to break this down into an example here with our favorite agent, James Bond. But before I do that, are there any questions that came in? I see. All right, so let's jump in and kind of put this into action here with agent James Bond. Last Monday's SLAs, or even the last week's SLAs, were forecasted to be met every day at 80%. Overall, the week underperformed. Your workforce agent, James Bond, needs to find out what happened and explain what mitigating steps were taken and what's being done to prevent this from happening again. And where do they begin? Just like what we talked about in the last section here. So we're going to go through just a couple examples of data you might see here. Please do not, hinge on this data being as completely accurate. We're making examples that we can see here. This data may not work in real life, so we'll just roll with it here. But first of all, agent James Bond needs to check adherence, the conformance, the shrinkage levels at a minimum. Check these sort of things. You can check more, and then check them at the hourly level. So Let's go ahead and look here. We've got our adherence, and we can see that adherence actually kind of started off pretty low, 70% earlier on in the day. It got better at 9 a.m. and then it dipped a little bit again at 10. Conformance, we're just going to kind of ignore this one. It's pretty high. We're getting hours that we expected. But shrinkage here, whoa, we had some low adherence and we had low shrinkage, which is unfortunate. But then our shrinkage just kind of shoots up here, 45 and 50%. So to me, here's how I'm going to start building a story. I've got shrinkage impacting later on at about 9 or 10 a.m. And then we also have adherence. That was doing better, but honestly dropping a bit during these time frames. So that was our supply. So now we'll go to the workload here. Let's check our phone volumes and phone handle times. This one we've broken it out a little bit more. You'll traditionally see these as your plans and your actuals, but let's look at the same hours. We got 8, 9, and 10 a.m. We know that 9 and 10, we started to see some impacts from our adherence and our shrinkage. And we can look at the volume here, and something similar happens. We actually started off the day under volume and then started going above volume. So there's another part of the story here. Oh, volume is going to be an impact here. But to just not write it off as, oh, overall workload is up, let's take a look at our handle times and let's give a hand here to our agents, because volume went up, adherence wasn't the best, shrinkage went up, but the agents who were still on the phones were actually getting their handle times and keeping them in check. So you can see we thought it was going to be 800 seconds. They were a little bit over. 815 seconds, they were under. Handle time went up, but it was under what was planned. And then handle time dropped even lower. So for the agents that were still on the phones, they were doing a great job helping out the customers here. And that's a good point to bring up. It wasn't just overall workload being up. It was really volume being up. Handle time actually gained us a little bit of that workload back. So here it is. Explain to MI6 what happened. What's our debrief here? Supply. Shrinkage sharply increased while adherence to schedule dipped. Conformance was about as expected. Demand volume increased well above plan while handle time stayed within bounds. Actually, I might even change that to be like, and the agents really did help by bringing it under what we expected by the end of it. So summary here, while citizens called in more than expected, our agents were able to keep their handle times within spec. However, SLA, which largely missed due to the high increase in shrinkage, coupled with the poor schedule adherence, and I think we should have had a note on here as well about the volumes. It was just missed on the note. But going forward, shrinkage will be more spread out to not go above 25% for interval, and adherence made a higher priority in measuring agent performance. This is just to say we're going to do a better job of planning it and then measuring it. And you can see here that the note was specifically about if there was an outage driving up that volume, what can we actually change? This is kind of positioned around some sort of outage driving up volume, but also if there was a repeatable time of that Monday with seeing the volume come up, then we would be adjusting our forecasts and starting to move schedules around as well. So lots of topics we went over there. Our nice example with our favorite workforce agent, James Bond. Do we have any other questions before I hand it over to Val to show us some of how you do this in a symbol?
Adrian, we have one other question that came in, and this is kind of a general one from Jody. This is a really good question, though. I think a lot of people might be on the same page. So if we could take just a minute.
Yeah.
It just says having a hard time understanding the difference between conformance and adherence still. Can we run through the definitions again?
Yeah, so conformance and adherence, conformance, and we actually, maybe we can send out the link to the webinar that we did on this. Conformance is basically, are we getting the total amount of hours that we expected from an agent? So, if an agent's expected to provide 6 hours out of the day, they can conform to those 6 hours, even if it didn't meet their schedule. That would be terrible. You would see huge adherence misses, all sorts of misses, but we would still they conformed, they gave us the amount of hours that we expected to the day. And then adherence is, are they actually matching the schedule that's planned? And a lot of the time adherence is based off of adherence to productive events. So out of the productive events, that's outside of your lunch, that's outside of your breaks, that's outside of your meetings, your coachings, the time to go see the ice cream man. Out of those, are you actually adhering to that? So if you're logging off a couple minutes early to go to lunch, if you're like me and you're logging off 10 minutes early, so you get the ice cream man before he leaves, those are all gonna hit into your adherence. Specifically, are you meeting the schedule that was planned for you? So that's a very high level overview there. Like I said, we have an entire webinar that went into it as well, where I hopefully explained it a lot more in depth there. Hopefully that covers it for now. I see there might be some more stuff in the chat. Did we have another question or two that came in?
Yes, we actually had a question around the percentage deviation from expected or forecasted average handle time and what percentage would be considered normal until it's worrying. So for example, forecasted AHT is 20 minutes, but it's been 23 minutes lately.
Yes. Okay. This was our favorite. We went to SWPP just a month or so ago, and the favorite kind of joke that went around is there's like no industry standard. So with this is something that you're going to have to kind of go in and see for yourself. Usually the rule of thumb is that like that 5% variance is a good rule of thumb. If you go above 5% variance, it's usually where you start to see some impacts. Now, if you have a very short handle time, I mean, it can be some contacts are very quick. It's just, I don't know, some sort of checking a balance or something, then 5% might not make a lot of sense because it can be in, 10, 15 seconds, even single digit seconds. If you have a very, very, very quick contact rate, and then 5% may not work as that 20 minutes, and then we're adding on, minutes of time there. So use that as the rule of thumb, but definitely go and check. You can actually set, a lot of times you can set kind of thresholds to kind of highlight and say, hey, we're seeing some sort of issue here, even in your real-time views. My rule of thumb was always 5%. Maybe on my live channels, I might knock it down to 3% if I was feeling like I really wanted to put in that extra time there. Oh, and thank you, Valerie, for putting in what SWPP was. That was the big, as it kind of gets informally referred to, the Coachella of workforce management events. We encourage you all to attend if you can in 2023 too. All right, I've talked for a while now. Are there any other questions here, or should we pass it off to Val?
I believe there was one more from Elizabeth Shelton.
Yeah, one more. And I think this one is good. It relates to a lot of what you talked about, Adrian, but on a more granular level, I think. So what is the best way to track individual adherence and shrinkage for a large team?
Yeah, so this is going to be as you just start to break things down. So as we were talking about before, you've got maybe a week, then a day, then the interval. That's where you want to kind of break it in from those big views down to the smaller ones. You will see some of this if you break it down into the intervals where you just start to see challenges with adherence. But otherwise, and we can actually do this in the tool, you can set up for individual teams outside of the queues and say, Team Valerie, Team Shelton, and then start to review those individually. When you do have to start going down to the teams, you don't, it is going to take some more work because you don't want to miss, let's say you're seeing a lot of impacts on that Monday timeframe, but a team that has low adherence doesn't work that Monday timeframe. So you're not really going to be looking for them when the issues are, but maybe for the company, you want to dig in. So you're going to need to start going through each of the managers, each of the team leads individually at T-Mobile, because we had thousands and thousands of agents. We actually had the RTAs, so the real-time analysts, would partner up with a group of coaches, a group of team leads at each site, and kind of spread out that workload and say, hey, here's your scorecard, here's a lot of different metrics for your team over the last week and what we've been identifying. That way it took this monumental task of going down to each individual team, broke it up into individual workforce agents, and we were able to divide that workload up. And I see the chat still going here. Did we get any more questions? Okay, great. Val, I'm gonna hand it over to you. I know we're getting close to time, so let's go through how we do it in Assembled.
Perfect. So I will zoom through this part since we'll be sending out some follow-ups where you can schedule time with Shelton and team to dive in deeper. But within Assemble, there's a couple of handy dandy reports that you can look at to really diagnose SLA. This first one, which might look familiar to a number of you folks, is the team performance report. This was actually renamed from the agent performance report. And this is really representative of the supply side framework that Adrian went over. So basically you are able to see average handle times, cases solved, and adherence at aggregated team levels, queue levels, and much more. You can slice and dice that data by utilizing our filters, which is in the top right-hand corner there. And you can also, within these top panels, compare individual agent performance with the aggregated average of the team. So that really comes in handy as well to identify areas of strength and opportunity. And below, we actually will also include individual agent-specific metrics. So for each agent within your teams, you can see cases solved, adherence, occupancy, utilization, and much more. And that's also really useful in that you can sort that for top performers as well as areas of opportunity as well. And lastly, you're able to filter this for whichever time ranges you desire, and you can do that in the top left-hand corner. All right, so next up, we have staffing heat maps, which also covers the supply side of the framework that Adrian discussed. And it's a really great way to see staffing down to an interval level without looking at each day individually. And you can also see other metrics, including not only scheduled versus required staffing, but also scheduled versus actual hours worked, and even more cuts of data. And so, for this particular example, taking a look at this team, on that net staffing section on the right-hand side, it definitely looks like they are quite underwater. We're seeing a lot of reds throughout. Also, this report is really handy in helping with what Adrian was saying earlier around how one particularly bad hour or a few hours can throw off your entire SLA. So you can really diagnose those specific points by looking at this report as well. All right, next up is my favorite comprehensive SLA diagnosis report is the forecasted versus actual report. So this one is actually very comprehensive because it marries both the supply and demand side of the equation. It allows you to see service levels broken down by hourly or daily intervals in terms of the workloads. And it also allows you to see what constitutes when SLA was like made or missed during a specific hour. So you can really use this to put together a story here. For example, if you were to look at a particular hour in red where SLA was missed, you can see exactly how many contacts were missed, as well as the response times, handle times, and the net staffing levels overall for that particular hour. Next up, this is the same report, just showing you a bit more granular information here with other metrics such as occupancy, handle times, and your staffing all broken out as well. So just a more zoomed in view for you. The last report that looks specifically at the demand side of the equation is the trends report. So this allows you to look at the volume that you've received across your channels coming in during days of the week. And what we do for you here is averaging those over any time frame you choose. So then you can get a really good idea of what days you might be the most busy. So for instance, with this particular team, Mondays and Fridays are days that, are higher volume. And so you can then adjust your staffing accordingly to accommodate for those specific high volume days. All right, so any questions? Let's see here.
Val, we had a good one come in related to the reports and assembled. Maybe we can try to give this one a shot. So did these reports incorporate planned shrinkage like absenteeism or time off that hasn't been recorded in assembled yet?
That is interesting. I think the piece of clarification that I'd love to follow up on is hasn't been recorded in assembled yet. We do have reports such as the schedule analytics report and much more that actually break all of these events out according to productive shifts scheduled, as well as PTO and non-productive events. But I do think that a key ingredient here is making sure that those non-productive events or PTO is actually scheduled in our system. And something that's really great is we're rapidly building out a lot of HR integrations to enable your PTO to seamlessly flow into assembled and not be a two-step process. And so that should hopefully resolve a lot of the issues there.
All right. I know we're 2 minutes over, but are there any burning questions that we can answer? It looks like there's still a lot of people on here, so I'm happy to field another one or two, or Val, if you do as well. Or if not, we can call it. We'll have the recording out as soon as we can. So I think there's no more questions, right?
One.
Oh, there's one.
And we do have, I think, a few that have trickled in. Yes, one from Jessica around the ticket SLA breach, but it looks like Shelton, you answered that, I think so.
Okay. Well, great. Now everybody is an expert in diagnosing their SLA. Please share with us if this has helped you, or if you were able to use this in your job. I would love to hear that personally. But thanks for joining, everybody. We'll get you out information, and we'll see you next month.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.